Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Richard Schoonhoven, and for my sins, I get to hang out with the people in the audience with the impoverished fashion sense, which is, it's actually my pleasure to teach philosophy at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and it's certainly my pleasure today to introduce our two very distinguished speakers. Our first speaker will be Dr. Amy Eckert. She is a professor of political science at the Metropolitan State University of Denver. Her interests in teaching and research focus on international relations, particularly international ethics and international law, including the just war tradition. She is the author of Outsourcing War, the Just War Tradition in the Age of Military Privatization. Dr. Eckert holds a BA from the University of Notre Dame, a JD from the University of Denver's Storm College of Law, and a PhD from the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. Our respondent today will be Audra Goodnight. She is a St. Catherine of Siena teaching fellow here in the ethics program at Villanova University. She received her PhD in philosophy from St. Louis University quite recently in 2018, so congratulations, under the guidance of Dr. Eleanor Stump. Audra's work focuses on second person and disability with a particular attention given to defending a robust theory of disabled flourishing. She works in feminist philosophy and bioethics, and her most recent publication is in the Journal of Medicine Philosophy titled A Life Worth Living, Value and Responsibility. Please join me in welcoming both of our speakers today, and in particular, Professor Eckert.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's really a pleasure to be here today. This conference seems to draw heavily on a couple of audiences that I don't belong to, but especially enjoy interacting with, military personnel and philosophers. As a civilian political scientist, I tend to focus on different sorts of things, but always learn from these populations. And in particular, I'm going to focus probably a bit more on institutions, as you can probably glean from the title of my talk. And the reason for this is not just that I'm a political scientist, but this has been an enduring feature of the just war tradition, the idea that the tradition has always reflected the prevailing political norms and institutions, which given its function, which is to limit and regulate what we think of as a non-ideal event, is probably pretty unsurprising. The reflection of institutions and just war tradition norms is particularly evident during times of real and significant institutional change. For instance, the demise of the feudal system in favor of the Westphalian state system. In the Middle Ages, as secular and religious authorities struggled for supremacy over one another, the just war tradition and its principles reflected this pluralism. Formulations of legitimate authority, for instance, recognized that a number of different authorities could potentially engage in the just use of force. In addition to secular feudal authorities at various levels, the church could also rightfully declare war. The purposes of this diverse range of actors was also reflected in the treatment of just cause. While secular actors could fight, for instance, to punish injuries, the church had the authority to wage war in defense of the faith, for example, conceptions of just cause that are probably quite unfamiliar to us today. The rise of the state and its eventual consolidation of control over the use of force would also come to be reflected in the principles of the just war tradition, which largely remain in that form today. Beginning with Thomas Aquinas, the authority to wage war came to be centered in the state. Aquinas' prince with no superiors, as he formulated it. Over time, the concept of authority within the just war tradition became institutional rather than personal, and it came to rest in the state. Similarly, the concept of just cause came to be also centered around the state, prioritizing purposes like self-defense. The non-state actors on whom states routinely relied and who previously may have had some authority in their own right came to be delegitimized with respect to the use of force. The connection between the state as a political institution and the use of force was so strong that the two concepts came to define one another, especially for political scientists. In the well-known words of Charles Tilly, war made the state, and the state made war. Even more fundamentally, the Max Weber's definition of the state defined it as the institution with a monopoly over the legitimate use of force. The centrality of the state to war-making meant that all other actors came to be delegitimized and relegated to the margins. They became, as John Williams put it, per se unethical when engaging in the use of force. The principle of legitimate authority in particular, which had come to be synonymous with the state, basically short-circuits the ethical analysis with respect to non-state actors engaged in the just use of force. For the past several centuries, the understanding of war as an activity engaged in by the state has been a fairly accurate representation of the political institutions and practices surrounding warfare. This statist framework served well as the institutional architecture around which ethical norms of warfighting could be built. However, it's safe to say that political institutions are again undergoing significant transitions that have important implications for the just war tradition. The monopoly over the legitimate use of force, once enjoyed by the state, has started to unravel. The reversal of the state monopoly over the use of force began in the middle of the last century when civil war, or non-international armed conflict, replaced international armed conflict as the dominant form of political violence. The pervasiveness of civil war and the insurgent movements that fight them meant that the large-scale re-entry of non-state actors into warfare. Despite the pervasiveness of rebel movements and other non-state actors, civil war still has statist overtones, as these are conflicts that are fought for the control of states. As the 20th century wound down, actors that do not have political ties to a particular state or even necessarily hold statist aspirations have emerged and become more involved in conflict in their own capacity, seeking a goal other than statehood or control of a state. Some of these actors have become involved in conflict against states. Al-Qaeda is one such organization. Its goals include influencing policies of states, but not statehood for itself. Moreover, these non-state actors sometimes demonstrate capabilities that are on par with the states they fight. A very striking example of this was the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, in which Hezbollah was able to fly drones over Israeli territory. The process of globalization has brought to the state system changes so sweeping that some now refer to the system as post-international. Yale Ferguson and Richard Mansbach, for instance, develop an account of post-internationalism that emphasizes change, while at the same time recognizing that these changes are not entirely without historical precedent. They see the change that results from the rise of post-internationalism as the result of two processes. First, the growth of somewhat amorphous regional and global authorities, and second, the fracturing of existing political authorities into smaller communities. Ferguson and Mansbach note that key among these actors are those that provide private violence or security. And I think they're right with this emphasis, as these actors have really had the effect of breaking that state monopoly over the legitimate use of force. One actor that I would like to call special attention to are, of course, private military companies, which engage in the use of force with the consent of the state. And I'm going to suggest that it's difficult to argue that they're doing so illegitimately, because states are major consumers and producers of private force. Likewise, a number of states, including the U.S., have systems, regulatory schemes to license private military companies. But while they operate with state consent, they also operate independently from the state. And so we can't treat them as mere agents of the state. They cannot, for instance, be compelled to provide services. And U.S. practice is to treat them as outside the military chain of command. The Army Field Manual is actually explicit on this point, that private military companies are not part of the military chain of command. So even in instances where these companies are acting in a way that serves U.S. interests, they operate legitimately but outside of state control. In functional terms, and thinking back to those historical antecedents, they resemble the privateers and mercenaries on whom states relied prior to the French Revolution and the consolidation of national control over force. And for these reasons, I'm suggesting that we can no longer treat the state as having the exclusive monopoly over legitimate use of force that it once enjoyed. The rise of these actors and their incorporation into warfare doesn't necessarily signal the demise of the state, but instead speaks to its transformation. While the state is still involved in armed conflict, even states no longer act without private actors. In this global order, war itself is becoming transformed into what political scientist Mary Kaldor has termed new wars. And I'm going to quote some of her language here describing these new wars as involving a blurring of the distinctions between war, usually defined as violence between states or organized political groups for political motives, organized crime, which is violence undertaken by privately organized groups for private purposes, usually financial gain, and large-scale violations of human rights, violations undertaken by states or politically organized groups against individuals. Kaldor locates the emergence of new wars within the context of the eroding of the state's monopoly on force and the rise, at least in relative terms, of non-state actors. And we now see a range of non-state actors engaged in the use of force, including groups that we characterize as terrorist groups, transnational criminal organizations, and others. If it was ever accurate to describe political violence as an activity of states alone, this is no longer the case. This is not to say that the state no longer has a role to play with respect to warfare, but even when states fight, they do so in concert with networks of public and private actors, and we cannot afford to ignore these private actors. The institutional changes to the state that culminate in the breaking of the state's monopoly over the legitimate use of force, coupled with the increasingly active role of non-state actors in warfare, means that the normative marginalization of non-state actors, which renders them per se unethical, should no longer hold. This poses certain challenges if we're thinking about this in the context of ethical norms. The first piece of this challenge is rethinking the principle of legitimate authority. While the state monopoly over political violence remained intact, it was safe to treat war as a form of state violence, while violence by non-state actors was generally stigmatized as criminal activity or terrorism. Indeed, the principle of legitimate authority existed largely for the purpose of distinguishing state action from illegitimate violence by non-state actors. The demise of the state's monopoly on the legitimate use of force leads us to a choice. One possible choice that is advanced by the so-called revisionist strand of just war thinking is to basically jettison the principle of legitimate authority. Although I think it's more accurate to represent this position as denying the need for any authority beyond the individual to license the use of force. Revisionist just war theory is strongly cosmopolitan. It begins with the moral standing of the individual rather than the state. And in Cecile Farber's Cosmopolitan War, she illustrates this type of reductive individualism. And she describes war as being about individuals maiming and killing each other. Fabre reconstructs an ethic of war that begins with the well-being of the individual rather than the moral standing of the state. As such, she sees little need for the principle of legitimate authority as it has been historically understood. Rather than treating war as the right of states or belligerencies that are engaged in civil war, she argues that groups of actors which act in unstructured, disorganized ways, as well as individuals themselves, can have the right to go to war. It is important to note that this position is related to her reinterpretation of just cause as encompassing violations of human rights. Indeed, it's this definition of just cause that distinguishes Fabre's position from previous formulations of authority. Many scholars, going back to the Middle Ages, extended to all individuals the right to use force in self-defense, but they distinguished that act of self-defense from war. Pope Innocent IV, for instance, recognized a distinction between war and an act of self-defense, a distinction that was embraced by many thinkers who followed him. Bartolus likewise acknowledged that individuals could use force to defend their person or property, but the right to declare a public war was limited to the Roman people or their emperor. Thomas Aquinas reiterated this distinction with a discussion that hinged on the question of intent. So Fabre's understanding of just cause and the individual right to declare war may be somewhat more expansive than self-defense against forcible attack, which was the limit of permissible self-defense in the Middle Ages. As such, the revisionist position that she represents is one which locates authority to wage all types of war not in a collective moral agent like the state or an insurgent group or the sovereign representing one of these groups, but in the individual. And this view is closely connected to the central claim of the revisionist that sees war in a moral sense as being basically coterminous with all other domains and governed by the same moral norms that would govern everyday life. This approach rejects the existence of any morally significant distinction between war and everyday life. As such, I argue that it disregards the real and morally significant differences between individual and collective political violence, as well as any morally significant value to political communities. This disregard for the interests of political community make this approach somewhat unsatisfying. Although the traditional statist approach also has shortcomings, namely a failure to accommodate the changes in political institutions that we're seeing in the world today, its recognition of the moral significance of community is worth salvaging. As such, I'm going to present another choice, which is to apply something more like orthodox or traditional just war theorists in terms of value and community, but without the foregone conclusion in favor of the state. The revisionist proposal to jettison the legitimate authority principle assumes that legitimate authority really adds no value to the jus ad bellum inquiry about the just use of force. It seems clear that any formulation of the legitimate authority principle that equates legitimate authority with the state does not reflect the realities of the international system. Nevertheless, community is important to discussions about the social practices of war and the ethical principles that apply to them. Revisiting the discussion of legitimate authority in the classical period and Middle Ages can suggest some reasons why we might value this principle, and also points to types of actors beyond states that may be able to satisfy this principle of legitimate authority. First, authority matters because those who wield it act to advance a common good. This stands in contrast to the narrow, limited, though just, purpose of self-defense that justifies individual use of force or other types of private interests. This concept of care for the common good goes back to ancient Greek thought and is carried into early Christian thought. And the actors recognized as legitimate authorities in the Middle Ages acted to protect a community. Thomas Aquinas noted that, quote, "As the care of the commonweal is committed to those who are in authority, it is their business to watch over the commonweal of the city, kingdom, or province subject to them." Christine de Pizan echoed this in limiting her account of authority to declare war, saying, "No baron or other person, however great he may be, may undertake war without the express permission and will of his sovereign lord." That this law is right is demonstrated by plain reason, for if it were otherwise, of what use would the sovereign princes be, who were not set up except to do right for and on behalf of their subjects who might be oppressed by some extortion, to defend them and keep them as the good shepherd risks his life for his flock. Suarez pressed this even further, suggesting that more actions might be permitted in defense of the city or commonwealth than in defense of the individual, because the good defended is shared by many and is therefore of a higher grade. Within the modern political context, it may not immediately be clear which element within the state is the highest authority with responsibility for the common good, but there are certainly a number of possibilities. In a modern democratic system, for instance, power could be either the executive or legislative branch, or in a real sense, the people. Right? I suggest here that the groups of actors responsible for the well-being of a community could include certain non-state actors who advance the common good of a non-territorial community. However, it would exclude actors like transnational criminal organizations who engage in the use of force primarily for private gain. It would also exclude individuals, other than in instances of self-defense or defense of others, individuals who are not charged with the responsibility to act based on the common good, act on the basis of their own private interests. While they may commit violence on a large scale, it is likely to be personal rather than political in nature. Second, legitimate authorities are restrained and deliberative. They do not resort to the use of force in response to any and all potential provocations, or even the subset of provocations that may constitute just cause. While critics of legitimate authority suggest, as Lori Calhoun has, that the state will interpret jus ad bellum principles in a manner that promotes war when this is the desired outcome, it is not clear that individuals would do much better in this regard. An individual may react quickly or emotionally to a slight or provocation without engaging in much deliberation about the justness of the cause. None of this is to suggest that the state cannot also have a form of consciousness, and it is commonplace to speak of states as feeling emotions. For instance, we often hear people say that Germany was humiliated by the Versailles Treaty following World War I, or that the U.S. was vengeful after the September 11th attacks. However, the deliberative process by which corporate moral agents, groups, act is, if nothing else, slower and less impulsive than the individual decision-making process, allowing for a cooling off period that may not exist in interactions among individuals. And because a legitimate authority has the responsible for securing the common good, as noted above, it should be hesitant to jeopardize the well-being of the community by fighting. As Francisco de Victoria wrote, "A prince should accede to the necessity of war when he is dragged reluctantly, but inevitably, to it. The presumption should be in favor of the preservation of the community and its members." In addition to their greater potential for restraint, legitimate authorities may engage in a process of consultation and deliberation with elements of the community, including particularly those who are opposed to war. We see Sison and Ingerd referring to this as openness to advice and knowledge, and this element of the legitimate authority principle justifies the authority's decision when it is based on a wide range of information, including sound military advice and solid competence about the region in which the operation is to take place. This does not necessarily mean that only actors in a democratic structure could satisfy the principle of legitimate authority. Non-liberal communities could also satisfy this requirement through alternative modes of consultation and deliberation. Third, entities have been recognized as having the authority to declare war when there is no common jurisdiction with authority over the two parties who would be fighting in the potential war. This was the justification for not extending legitimate authority too far down the chain of authority in the feudal system. Two individuals involved in a dispute who were subject to the common jurisdiction of a superior lord could submit their dispute to that lord for jurisdiction. In that case, there was literally no entity capable of definitively resolving the dispute between these parties. This may still be the case, as the international system lacks a centralized authority capable of making an authoritative resolution of a dispute. This remains so despite the growth in international organizations and international tribunals, as these entities lack the universal and compulsory jurisdiction of other types of authorities. It may still be true even where there are institutions, but effective access is denied to the party contemplating the use of force. But where there is a jurisdiction available to parties, those parties would lack the legitimate authority to engage in the use of force. With respect to states, there is some overlap between the jurisdictional issue and the principle of last resort. Certainly, where a state is engaged in a dispute with another state, using dispute resolution mechanisms like international or regional courts where available may be ethically required before the use of force is a last resort for resolving the conflict. But in a strict sense, these institutions do not exercise sovereign jurisdiction over states. If we extend our consideration beyond the state, most of these institutions are in fact unavailable to non-state actors with few exceptions. One such exception, as example, is the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. The Inter-American human rights system generally is exceptional in that it accepts complaints from individuals and groups without member states needing to ratify additional instruments. But this really is an exception, and for the most part, non-state actors would satisfy this requirement of not being subject to the jurisdiction of an entity with the authority to address their grievances. Taken collectively, these limitations, which draw on the just war tradition's rich past, can provide guidance for navigating the renewed complexity of legitimate authority in the future. These criteria would allow some, but not all, non-state actors to satisfy a legitimate authority principle. What type of non-state actor could justly use force under this reimagined legitimate authority principle? I believe there are a number of real-world actors who could potentially satisfy at least some of the criteria that I've been talking about so far. But I'm going to present to you with a quasi-hypothetical example of the type of actor that could potentially satisfy this reformulated legitimate authority principle. I'm choosing a hypothetical case to kind of avoid the political or emotional baggage of actual actors and their circumstances, but the example is only quasi-hypothetical in that it does draw on a real-world organization, and it's also quasi-hypothetical in the sense that what I'm going to talk about is entirely possible. It could happen tomorrow. Well, some already advocate the possibility of just war by certain non-state actors, such as insurgent groups. I would like to explore the possibilities of just war by non-territorial actors. Imagine a human rights NGO, a non-governmental organization, with the capacity to engage in humanitarian intervention as well as just advocacy. I'm going to call this Amnesty International 2.0. With the availability of private force in the international system, this scenario is not a far-fetched example, and we have seen other NGOs, including, for example, the World Wildlife Fund, who have employed this option in the past. Amnesty International 2.0 may continue to engage in the same monitoring and advocacy campaigns that are familiar to us, but it also aspires to fill the gap of state inaction by forcibly intervening in instances of gross violations of human rights. Membership in this organization is open to any individuals concerned with the issues of human rights, and its members are found all over the world in every country that has access to the internet. Issues and actions taken by the organization in support of human rights are determined by the organization's leadership in consultation with the larger membership of the organization. And I note that this would be a more representative practice than that engaged in by some states that are unquestionably treated as legitimate authorities. The group monitors collectively the chosen situations and determines appropriate courses of action from among the range of choices. The most serious crises or emergency situations may in fact require military intervention in order to save the lives of those at risk. Even for state actors, the international system is a system without a common authority, and for a non-state actor like Amnesty International 2.0, this is even more strongly true. So assuming that there are some non-state actors, such as this hypothetical example, who could satisfy the revised legitimate authority principle that I've presented you with, the next step would be to start to consider their claims to the just use of force pursuant to the full body of jus ad bellum and even jus in bello principles. And I'm not going to get into that today because my time is running far too short to take up these additional difficult questions. But I agree with claims made by others, such as Michael Gross, that we may have some insurgent groups that would be able to satisfy jus ad bellum principles under a relaxed reading of legitimate authority. I think this claim is valid, but I would argue that we need to look beyond insurgent groups to other types of non-state actors who may be able to satisfy this test as well. I also want to emphasize that application of the full body of jus ad bellum and jus in bello principles in a very real, rigorous, and critical way to actors dismissed as non-state actors in the past will also be important. There are certainly many groups active at present who would fail the jus ad bellum or jus in bello tests or both. But if the legitimate authority principle no longer stalls or short circuits our analysis, a group with a just cause that's able to fight in a manner consistent with jus in bello norms may in fact be justified in using force to pursue its goal. Opening the door to some non-state actors would mean that the legitimate authority principle would again become an integral part of the jus ad bellum inquiry and help us to think critically about the nature of the actor advancing a claim to the just use of force. At the same time, retaining the qualities that form the historical core of this principle still fulfills the function of its original purpose, to mitigate the ill effects of war by limiting its practices to states, or in the pre-Westphalian system, to political entities with the means to raise up and train professional fighting forces. Given the role that the private force in particular continued to play even after the rise of the state system, the line between state and non-state actors did not become a bright one until after the French Revolution, when prohibitions on privateering and mercenarism began to emerge. To the extent that we're seeing this monopoly being reversed, we need to again open up application of these jus ad bellum principles to other types of actors and eliminate the undue prejudice against non-state actors who may also be pursuing just causes. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eckert. We will now hear from Professor Goodnight, and then we will have time for questions.
Well, thank you, Professor Eckert, for this engaging paper. I enjoyed working through the ideas you presented and found your discussion of the legitimate authority principle to be quite informative. So thank you, I appreciate that. This morning, I will offer my comments in the following order. So first, I want to offer a brief summary of what I take to be the central ideas in the paper. Second, I will suggest some need for clarification in some of the terms and concepts used. And then finally, I will raise some concerns for the hypothetical example that we just heard about. Who has the authority to engage in the just use of force? This question drives the central concern of the paper as I understand it. We learn that past systems placed authority in the hands of a number of different legitimate authorities, including the state, the church, and secular feudal groups. More recently, the state has become the main, if not only, legitimate actor in the just use of force. With the legitimate authority to declare war rooted in the state, any historical ethical norms for non-state actors to declare war no longer held. They became, quoting John Williams, per se unethical. The problem that emerges from placing legitimate use of force exclusively in the hands of the state, as Eckert points out, is the erosion of state monopoly on force. There are a number of non-state actors that engage in the use of force currently. Thus, she suggests we need to relook at the ethical norms that can offer a framework for non-state actors to justly use force. Eckert proposes two choices for rethinking the principle of legitimate authority. First, we might jettison the principle of legitimate authority altogether. This choice places the individual in the position of deciding what sorts of actions protect the well-being of the individual, such as the use of force. One worry that arises from such an individualistic approach to authority is the blurring of issues related to war from issues of everyday life, as Eckert notes. A second worry raised by this first choice is the loss of values and moral significance of community and the common good. A third worry created by the first choice is that the individual right to declare war depends on an acknowledgement of moral norms, but it's not clear where these moral norms would come from or be rooted in, other than the individually perceived notion of what constitutes a violation of human rights, for example. If the just cause needed to declare the use of force is rooted in the individual subject, then this position may lead to chaos. Of course, skepticism toward this view is shared by Professor Eckert, so she proposes a different approach. The second choice, which Eckert endorses, is to retain the principle of legitimate authority that prioritizes the protection of the common good, but to widen the scope of legitimate actors to include some non-state actors. These actors would use their authority to care and protect the common good, not their own private gain. They would exercise careful deliberation when deciding when or how to use force. And then finally, Eckert closes her discussion with a hypothetical example of what kind of non-state actor could be imagined engaging in just use of force. I wish now to suggest several parts of the paper that could benefit from clarification and some elaboration. First, it would be helpful to have more context for the discussion of state and non-state actors. When we are introduced to the notion that the state is interchangeable with war, for instance, what would be a historical example of this mutual definition? You then mentioned the understanding of war as a state activity that has developed over the past centuries. Where specifically are you talking about, though? In Europe, Africa, Asia, or does this matter? More context would be helpful in the text that follows as well. When you highlight the erosion of force by the state in the mid-20th century, I take you to mean the Vietnam and Korea wars and/or the civil wars in Africa. But again, offering specific examples is important to help guide the reader's understanding of such a state erosion. Second, the use of state actors and non-state actors are at times ambiguous and abstract throughout the paper. So by offering some concrete examples of what do we mean by the state actors, non-state actors, who are concrete examples of these actors, would give the reader more substance to better grasp the points, it seems to me. Third, you suggest early on that states that consume and produce private force have regulatory schemes to license private military contractors. You go on to suggest that, and I quote, while they operate with state consent, they cannot be described as illegitimate actors. I'd like to hear more about why you think PMCs are not illegitimate actors, or why they are legitimate actors. It would seem that the state may legitimately license PMCs, since they have the authority to do so, but their legitimization could be unethical. Does unethical legitimization make a difference to the just use of force by PMCs? For example, is Blackwater a legitimate actor in the just use of force? What sort of conditions should be in place to ensure legitimate transfer of authority to a PMC from the state? More needs to be said here to persuade your reader that, in fact, PMCs are legitimate actors. Fourth, it remains unclear to me why the legitimate authority principle tied to the state doesn't reflect the international reality at this time. At the end of the day, it is the state sanctioning non-state, at the end of the day, is it the state sanctioning non-state actors to engage in force, whether or not this is ethical? What more do we gain from placing authority to engage in the just use of force by placing in the hands of non-state actors authority that's separate from the state? So these are sort of my suggestions for clarification and elaboration, and maybe we can talk more about that in Q&A. And then finally, I wish to discuss the hypothetical example given at the end of the paper. While I am sympathetic to the motivation that I perceive to be underpinning the example, namely a more effective and efficient way to advocate and protect human rights against violation, I do have some worries about the example that I will raise through a series of questions. Practically speaking, in the case of Amnesty International 2.0, or AI 2.0, who would make the decisions to forcibly intervene in instances of gross violations of human rights? For example, would it be the Secretary General of AI 2.0, a voting board, a democratic poll of AI 2.0's worldwide members? Couldn't we conceive of an NGO like AI 2.0 that is unethical? What ethical principles could hold such an NGO accountable to legitimate claims of protecting and promoting the common good, non-hasty engagement in conflict, and accurate interpretation of human rights violations? Would we need a universal set of ethics to draw from, especially for these non-state actors? An NGO like AI 2.0 would require a source of funding. Who's to say that a number of wealthy donors wouldn't have an undue influence on the decision to forcibly intervene in a certain perceived violation of human rights? For example, could AI 2.0 forcibly intervene to kick American forces out of Afghanistan or Somalia? What happens when the state is engaged in human rights violations itself? Could AI 2.0 forcibly engage the USA, for example, because a majority of its members or board disagree with the legitimacy of the state actors? Lastly, some practical concerns include the following. Who would be responsible for weapon supply if they're engaged in fighting, for the actual fighting that's going on, for pay, for burying the dead, for dealing with prisoners, and for judging captives? So careful attention to these concerns is needed to strengthen the plausibility of the non-state actor proposed in this hypothetical example. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The good news is I think we have about half an hour for questions, so please. We have...
Hello, Cadet Alcorn. That's what we have to do. But Dr. Eckert, you said there was no, if I understood your argument correctly, you said there was no international order of hierarchy, which would have someone on top of the system that could delineate who has legitimate use of force, if I'm not mistaken. Where you said that exists in the feudal system, it doesn't exist now. We're in a sort of state of anarchy in the current global political world, because there's no top dog. But would you disagree that America is not acting as that top agent? Like because when we see wars happening across, like overseas, like in Kosovo and Bosnia, or with Iraq, and like we think that war is unjust, we decide that this war is not just. We go over and we end it. So are we not that top actor that can decide who is and isn't just in their wars?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a good one. That really kind of gets at the nature of what the international system is like. When I was taken to that point in the context of jurisdiction, what I'm really talking about is I'm talking about an entity with the authority to make a final and binding determination on that. And if we think about it in contrast to our domestic political system, right? If we have a dispute within our domestic political system, we have an entity that has the authority to make a determination that's final and binding, from which there is no further appeal, right? If we think about that in contrast to the international system, we don't have any authority that really functions in the same way. Even if we're thinking about an organization like the United Nations, for instance. The United Nations, there are a few instances where it can actually act independently of its member states and make those kinds of determinations. So even if we're thinking about something like the International Court of Justice, or some body along those lines, this is an entity that doesn't have kind of universal and compulsory jurisdiction in the same way that domestic political associations do. So I think you're actually getting at a really important point, because in the absence of something like that, the burden really does fall, at least in part, to state actors. And when we're thinking about which states in the international system are going to perform these functions, there is a disproportional reliance on powerful actors in the international system. So I think that your question is raising an important point, that as a dominant actor in the international system, as arguably still the most powerful actor in the international system, isn't this our job? And to an extent it is, because there's no one else necessarily capable and willing to undertake that function. But I think it's also important to distinguish between power and authority. Otherwise, we kind of risk falling into a situation where might makes right. And even where we kind of have the power and willingness to act, there are real instances where we get it wrong, either by relying on mistaken intelligence or mischaracterizing intelligence that's there, or instances where we don't act but should. One of the reasons that I chose an organization engaging in humanitarian intervention as my hypothetical example is because we've seen real instances where powerful states in the international system don't act when they clearly should. Rwanda, for example, the genocide in Rwanda, international community stood by and watched. So it's by necessity, by virtue of the nature of the system, it's a system that's imperfect, that's full of gaps. But I think you raise a really important point about the role of power within a system like that. Thank you.
We have a question here, and then there next.
Shall I go next?
Yes, please.
My name is Joe Betts. I used to teach philosophy here on Untitled. Your idea of non-state actors fascinates me. What about these three cases? How would you apply it to the Crusades? My guess is you will not find that they have legitimate authority, but you tell me. And then, what about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, a group of Americans who joined the established government in Spain to try to ward off Franco? And then thirdly, what about the Papal States? I'm not sure I know about, I'm asking about the Papal States, but what would happen if the Catholic Church declared war and hired mercenaries? Presumably, the Swiss Guards could be their mercenaries fighting. But the Papal States, and that was the Pope in control of territory, but the church separate from control of territory. Tell me about them as legitimate actors.
Oh, you've raised several fascinating historical examples, especially the Crusades, which actually were a holy war declared by the Catholic Church. And we're thinking especially in that example. We're thinking about a time frame before the emergence of the state system, before we came to have this conception that legitimate authority equals the state and no one else. It was an instance where authority within the system was a lot more diffuse than it came to be after the emergence of the state system, and especially a couple centuries later, after the French Revolution, we really saw states beginning to consolidate their practical control over military force. So yeah, the Crusades are actually an example of legitimate authority when it looked a lot different than it has come to look. Yeah, papal states, papal states. You're right that we're thinking here about an actor with the authority to declare war in the same way that any other state would be able to declare war. And you're not wrong that we're operating in a system now where any state, and even some non-state actors, do have access to the availability of private force. They're able to hire the force they need if they can't necessarily raise it, themselves. Now, admittedly, between the example of the Crusades and thinking about papal states today, our conception of just cause has undergone a transformation, right? And defense of the faith, which was the motivating cause for the Crusades, is not really recognized as just cause for war anymore. But supposing, the papal states were attacked, they could absolutely wage a war of self-defense. If they wanted to declare war in pursuit of some other just cause, providing that they can satisfy, the rest of our jus ad bellum analysis, and provided they fight justly, no inherent reason why they can't, why they couldn't exercise their authority in the same manner as any other state. It's a really interesting example. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade, another interesting, fascinating case. And we do see these instances of individuals being drawn to a cause not their own. Not their own in the sense of not their state's cause. And this is something that is really, it's really a fascinating phenomenon, right? And we're seeing this growing, I think, in the contemporary international system. You're of course talking about an example where individuals are drawn to a cause to fight fascism, which probably all of us would agree is a wonderful cause and something to which people should be devoted. If we look at the contemporary international system, we see people being drawn to causes other than their state's defense all the time. And unfortunately, it's not always such an admirable cause, right? ISIS, for instance, draws a significant number of foreign fighters who are called, to come and support ISIS's mission. When we see it happening today, I think it's further evidence of the fact that kind of the statist hold over the use of force is unraveling, right? This is no longer strictly a phenomenon engaged in by states. But if we kind of rewind a bit to the time frame of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, interesting scenario, right, where we've got individuals going to fight in another state's civil war, which we have seen throughout history. What's interesting about this, I think, is to really contrast it with our anti-mercenary norm, which is kind of another side of the same coin, where we see individuals being drawn into conflicts that aren't necessarily their state's conflict, not out of dedication to a political cause, as in your example, but often for pay, right? Really what has kind of led states to clamp down on mercenarism as an activity is the fact that there are essentially two problems with mercenaries. One is they're not fighting under the control of a state, under the control of what we would see as a responsible military command. And the other is that they're not fighting out of conviction, out of dedication to a cause. And this is why we see mercenarism still prohibited, despite the fact that we see private force flourishing in a different form. But I think that kind of your example eliminates at least one of those objections, right? We've still got people who aren't necessarily fighting under control of a state, certainly not under control of their state, but absolutely doing so out of individual conviction and out of dedication to a cause. So really interesting examples, so thank you for raising those.
I think this gentleman here was next, and then I saw Colonel Woodside, and then Seth, did you have a question?
Hi, I'm Owen Goodchild. I'm a senior at Radnor High School. And one of the things that struck me about both this conversation and the last conversation has to do with the military-industrial complex. And so one of the things I really started to identify here is that in a system in which non-state actors can be legitimate belligerents in war, it seems as though that we are incentivizing more armed conflict. So yes, we might be addressing things such as, for example, the Rwandan genocide. Had an NGO been able to enter and fight there, we could have saved lives, but how many lives are we going to spend fighting in wars that could be solved diplomatically? One of the great strengths that I think the state system has is that, as the previous talk mentioned, when states have skin in the game, when it's their blood that needs to be spilt, they're less likely to engage in civil conflict. I would actually argue that's the best thing that came out of the Treaty of Westphalia, that a concept of sovereignty in which states had professional armies that they were raising, and then they were invested in preventing future war. I just worry that in a system in which we enable NGOs to engage in conflict, we are losing this disincentive for armed conflict and enabling an expansion of the military-industrial complex. So what are your thoughts on that?
On one level, I share your discomfort, right? Because the position that I'm taking is one that has the potential to expand the range of conflicts that would in fact be justified. And I do feel a degree of discomfort with that. But I don't know that I necessarily feel more uncomfortable because it's a non-state actor. In the previous session, I think one of the themes that came up that I think is so important is the fact that we as a society are increasingly disengaged with the wars we fight. If we think about our grandparents or great-grandparents, probably in your case, experience with World War II, even the people who weren't necessarily on the front fighting were very much engaged with the conflict. The war that was ongoing had a very real impact on their lives, not only because their family members, their friends, their neighbors were off fighting, but because they themselves were dealing with things like rations. They were being asked to invest literally in something like war bonds, for instance. If we think about that in contrast with our experience today, having been at war in Afghanistan for so many years now, this is something that has virtually no effect on our lives, on our daily lives. We're able to forget about it, right? We have the luxury of kind of being able to forget about it and disregard the fact that we have this ongoing conflict. So I don't know necessarily that the problem is along the lines of state and non-state actors. What I would suggest is that probably, regardless of the type of actor that we're thinking about engaging in the use of force, whether it is a human rights NGO or whether it's the U.S., is that we need to apply the just war criteria that we have in a way that's truly rigorous, that's truly critical, where we're not treating our jus ad bellum norms and the just war tradition as a checklist that we have to satisfy before we can engage in the conflict that we want to engage in, but to really think critically about things like, is this a last resort? What's our probability of success of obtaining our goal? And I think I was speaking primarily about the question of legitimate authority, but of course the rest of our body of principles still applies, including proportionality, which I think is really kind of at the heart of your question. Are we going to do more good than harm if we engage in the use of force? which is a very real consideration for any type of conflict, especially a humanitarian intervention. Especially if we're thinking about a scenario like the one I described, or like the real historical scenario I brought up of Rwanda. It's a real question: is intervention going to help to an extent that's going to outweigh the inevitable harm that we're going to cause? And that's absolutely always an open question. The nature of kind of engaging in this as part of our jus ad bellum process necessarily means we have to make some predictions. Predictions are often wrong, right? But we at least have to think seriously and engage with this question of will this be worth it? And I think that's the type of analysis that we really need to engage with in a meaningful sense, whether we're thinking about something like our involvement in Afghanistan or whether we're thinking about a scenario like humanitarian intervention.
Okay, thank you. I think I have Steve Woodside next, and then Seth, and then this gentleman here, please.
Hi, I'm Steve Woodside from West Point. It's an excellent question. So I had something similar in mind, but not from the standpoint or rationale of proportionality, but you mentioned maybe some of the moral grounding for legitimate authority as having to do with limiting violence per se, or something like that, right? But maybe legitimate authority, the best way to think about it is, so this is sort of a jettisoning, but less crazy proposal for jettisoning. Maybe it's just a proxy for some kind of consent mechanism, right? So the reason we have this so-called criterion of legitimate authority is that usually the legitimate authority, if it's working as it is, will have some mechanism to get the consent of the people, or the consent of those who are going to bear the costs of this war. And I think it was some similar to, that's sort of what I got from his point. Mm-hmm. And so what are the implications of, well, I'd like to know what you think about that, right, as a sort of legitimate authority is a consent for, or a proxy for consent. And then, so that, I don't think that would imply necessarily that it's just state actors that would have that kind of consent. But I am skeptical that an NGO or something of that, whatever, something of that scale or something where it's going to drag or could result in harming people whose consent they don't have and those types of things. Maybe that's why we have it. And what do you think about that?
I think this is an intriguing question. Is legitimate authority kind of a proxy for consent? And I think that formulation would be an advance over the way we currently tend to think about legitimate authority. During kind of the heyday of state authority over use of force, during kind of peak Westphalia, if you will, really the legitimate authority principle became so hollowed out that it was basically a check mark. Are we dealing with a state actor or not? And of course, the standard you described where we're thinking about legitimate authority as consent of some form, even that is really more robust than the way we're thinking about legitimate authority under the state system. Because of course we have states that engage in armed conflict without any kind of consent process at all. When we talk about legitimate authority being recognized as synonymous with the state, we're not talking only about democracies. We're not only talking about states that have got some kind of an internal process for consultation and deliberation. We're talking about any state, right? So, dictatorship or a monarchy where one person has the authority to say, yes, we're going to war without consulting anyone else. It would satisfy the kind of statist formulation of the legitimate authority principle, because despite being non-democratic, it's of course still a state. I think that consent, or at least consultation, really is an important piece of why legitimate authority should matter. I would expand it a little further than saying just consent. I would suggest that there kind of does need to be at least that deliberation, that deliberative process. And I think absolutely, the question of costs has to be brought back into it, right? Immanuel Kant in his Perpetual Peace essay is suggesting that, we're going to see states with states that are democracies behaving more peacefully because people who bear the costs make the decision about whether or not the state should go to war. And we've become so distanced from, people making the decision, being the people who bear the costs, that if Kant was ever right, the situation he describes has long since ceased to exist. But I would certainly suggest that that consent is a really important piece of legitimate authority. But I think we have to recognize that these deliberative mechanisms and these polities, these political communities, they no longer extend just to the state, right? The state is sort of no longer the only game in town in terms of political representation. People belong to multiple different types of communities. Certainly still states, but also, I use the example of an NGO to get at a community that really forms out of personal conviction, right? The belief that respect for human rights is important. Or whether we're thinking about some of the entities at play in Afghanistan, right, where community is based on ethnicity or it's based on faith. Increasingly we're seeing polities and communities that aren't states also being represented, which is why I'm suggesting if we agree that the monopoly over the legitimate use of force once held by the state is gone, then I think we have to be willing to look beyond the state in terms of these other types of communities. Yeah.
I think Seth, and then this gentleman here. Hopefully we have time.
Hi, ma'am. Seth Sawalski, a senior at West Point. I had a quick question about, so you talk about, obviously, like the ability of NGOs to intervene and things like that. And I wanted to see how you thought that argument might apply to intrastate actors. So hypothetically, for example, in the United States, if a group of individuals who formed like a large enough like community, you could say, were to see something like or be affected by gang violence or sort of white supremacy, like violent white supremacy, or some other sort of violent actions by another group, and they had sat down about it and they had talked about it, and all of them had the means to use force against these groups, and they had all consented to do so, and they had the right intention of sort of eliminating this threat to potentially other people. It seems like that would meet all of your criteria for a legitimate authority or legitimate actor, and just intuitively to me that doesn't seem to be like something that we would want to justify, because that might justify like vigilante justice groups and things like that. But I could see a situation where if a group thought that the state wasn't doing the proper job of sort of focusing on eliminating these groups or suppressing them, then they might take matters into their own hands, and based on those criteria, it seems like it would be justified as a legitimate actor based on your revised definition of it. So I was just curious what your thoughts were.
No, that's a great question. The one kind of prong of my argument where I have doubts that this could satisfy the revised legitimate authority principle would be the question of not being subject to a common jurisdiction, right? Because if we're envisioning that everyone involved in this scenario is within the same state, then at least theoretically they've got access to political or judicial institutions within their state to help resolve this conflict without necessarily going to war, so to speak, right? Of course, there are there are situations where something like this would be happening, and in practical terms, the group may lack access to the political and judicial institutions of their state. We can think of a lot of instances where a minority group might be repressed through either official means or kind of quasi-official groups that are operating with the consent of the government, or at least the government looking the other way, where the members of the persecuted group may be, in practical terms, denied access to those institutions, right? They call the police to come and intervene, and nothing happens, for instance. If we've got that kind of a scenario, in some ways, I mean, that's almost our Civil War scenario, right? Where the repressed group, the group that's targeted violently and doesn't have the means to resolve the conflict through the political or judicial mechanisms of the state, ends up resisting violently. And I mean, I think it's becoming uncontroversial that there's at least the potential for that type of an instance to be an instance that would satisfy not only the legitimate authority principle, but kind of our just war criteria more broadly. We would still have to kind of apply the rest of our body of principles. We would have to kind of pay attention to how conflict is waged. But yeah, I mean, where a group is kind of consistently and violently disenfranchised and persecuted in this way, I think that becomes kind of our insurgency or civil war type scenario. Yeah. Yeah.
So I believe we have time for perhaps one more question. So, sir, please.
Hello, I'm Steve Oldham. I teach at St. Joseph's Prep here in Philadelphia. Also an alum of Villanova and an Army brat who lived at West Point for a number of years. My concern with all this discussion, whether it's state actors or non-state actors, is a total lack of accountability in the use of violence in today's world. In the light of the International Court of Justice not being accepted by major state actors like the United States, because we're concerned about bringing our politicians or military who have abused force in all the many wars and proxy wars we've been involved in. I don't know where the accountability of the means used, the lack of proportionality and discrimination, whether it's the bombing of Yemen or whether it's the Central or South American interventions by either directly by the United States or proxy militaries and paramilitaries like in El Salvador. Just a total lack of accountability. I don't know if the just war theory, much less any of these scenarios, I don't think there is any just wars anymore because of the lack of accountability. More and more civilians, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis dead. Cluster bombs in Afghanistan. And now to the theater of the absurd, we have our President of the United States calling on bikers to come and support him in case there is a civil war in the next election. I mean, that's the theater of the absurd that we're getting in some of these discussions. Any comments?
I wish I could paint a happier picture than you have in terms of accountability, but I really can't. I think the most that we can really say about this, and I tell my international law students this, that we can view the international legal system as being a system that's primitive but evolving. So the International Criminal Court that you mentioned, for instance, far from a perfect system of accountability by any means. Unfortunately, it is the case that the states have the choice to accept or not the jurisdiction of the court. We have, of course, made the decision not to accept the jurisdiction of the court. But if we look at what the court has been able to accomplish elsewhere in the world, the trials and convictions that they have had, I suppose that gives us some hope that things are improving, even if not evenly. But in the end, I think this comes back to the very first question, right? We've got an international system where there isn't a central authority that's able to kind of police these things, and it falls to the states. And at least for those of us living in democratic states, there's the potential for at least the dissatisfaction of the people with the direction things are taking to be heard and to remedy the situation internally, even if we don't have that external mechanism for accountability. But sadly, I can't substantially disagree with the rather grim picture that you've painted.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, I teach for the U.S. Military Academy, and if we can't make the trains run more or less on time, really, who can? So I'm afraid we are out of time. Please join me in thanking our speakers once again.